Well, U.S. President Donald Trump's increased tariffs on steel and aluminum are now in effect. The levies now sit at 50%. Joining us is our Parliament Hill correspondent, Glenn McGregor. Glenn, let's start with House senior government officials.
Yeah, I think every day is a new day with these tariffs. It's concerning. To be honest, we're not 100% sure exactly what it means yet because the dust is still settling. But
reacting to the new taxes now in effect.
A lot of concern about this, particularly from the steel and aluminum industries, as well as their labor unions, all of them raising concerns.
25 to 50 obviously makes it that much less affordable for us to operate in Canada and to sell to the U.S.
How do you turn a job-saving plan into a $2 trillion disaster? Well, Trump's tariffs may have just written the playbook. Stick around to see how Europe took a brilliant detour around the mess, and why Harley-Davidson and Levi's might be crying into their spreadsheets. Quick favor before we move on. If you appreciate this content, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Believe it or not, more than 92% of viewers haven't subscribed yet. It's free and only takes a second, but it means the world to us. So did you subscribe already? Great. Thank you so much for your support. Now back to the video. What happens when you claim to protect jobs but end up putting a wrecking ball through entire industries? Enter Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs, a move once hailed as a stroke of genius in protecting American workers that quickly unraveled into what can only be described as the economic version of shooting yourself in the foot twice with fireworks. These tariffs were introduced back in 2018 under the banner of national security.
For exporters of metals to the United States, basically generally saying, they could handle the 25% tariffs. It would be difficult. They would take certainly a haircut on their revenues and the total amount that they're exporting to the U.S.
Tell me as well about some of the switch that you've made, because my understanding is you were bringing in U.S. steel. Now you are buying steel, from Quebec as well, and just, trying to figure out other places.
There will be a response, but it may not happen right away. And the reason, he says, is because they're in, quote, intensive discussions with the United States on tariffs. And it sounds like on tariffs generally.
Steel from amid all this unpredictability, correct?
Correct. Yeah, most of us Canadian manufacturers have seen this because this happened to us in 2018 on the last go-around.
A bold claim suggesting that imported steel and aluminum pose some kind of dire threat. The idea? If America slapped a tax on foreign metals, U.S. companies would rush to buy domestic steel, resurrecting factories, creating jobs, and making everything red, white, and blue again. But, spoiler alert, that's not exactly how things turned out. In fact, it spiraled so spectacularly that even Trump probably needed a cheat sheet to keep track of his own damage. Here's the thing with tariffs. They sound patriotic on paper, protect homegrown industries, keep those pesky outsiders at bay, and voila, instant economic boom, right? Hardly. What these tariffs did instead was hike steel and aluminum prices for American companies. From auto manufacturers to construction firms, industries that rely heavily on these metals suddenly found themselves paying more for raw materials than ever before. And who do we thank for that? The tariffs, which added a 25% tax on imported steel and a 10% tax on imported aluminum. What was supposed to punish foreign producers ended up hitting U.S. industries square in the face. The America First plan was quickly devolving into America Pays More, but we're just getting started. Take Harley-Davidson, for example, an unmistakable symbol of American freedom and open highways, right? Well, even they couldn't withstand the pressure. Faced with skyrocketing costs from these metal tariffs, Harley announced they'd be moving some of their production overseas to avoid paying Trump's precious taxes. Imagine being the guy who introduces a policy meant to protect American companies, only to have one of the most iconic ones start looking for an exit strategy. It's the real-world equivalent of trying to fix a toaster and accidentally setting your kitchen on fire. But Harley wasn't the only casualty. Far from it. Car manufacturers took another heavy blow. Ford Motor Company reported almost $1 billion in additional material costs directly linked to the tariffs. Let's put that number into perspective. $1 billion is roughly the GDP of a small country. This wasn't about pinching pennies. This was like wearing cement shoes in a swimming competition. The downstream effects didn't stop there. Numerous industries, from appliance makers to construction firms, saw layoffs piling up as production costs ate into profit. Even America's love affair with beer, because we all know beer in cans is an unspoken prescription for the nation's stress, became a victim. The aluminum tariffs raised the cost of making cans, and breweries were feeling the sting. You know it's bad when the fallout bailout reaches your happy hour. Let's talk numbers for a second, because they tell the real story here. A study from the Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that for every one job created in the American steel industry, 16 jobs were lost in downstream industries reliant on steel and aluminum. 16. So congratulations, you saved one factory in Pennsylvania, but closed an office in Michigan, a warehouse in Texas, and oh, let's throw in a few jobs in California for good measure. Not exactly what you'd call a victory parade. But here's the plot twist. This isn't where the consequences stop. Oh no, because Europe saw this whole debacle and thought, this is our chance to step in. And step in they did. European officials didn't just take Trump's tariffs lying down, they hit back with their own version of economic jabs. But more on that later. The key takeaway here is that Trump's tariffs ended up being the global laughingstock of economic policy. They didn't save American jobs, they made them more expendable. They didn't bring foreign industries to their knees. They brought headaches to domestic ones. And in the process, they handed over an open invitation for economic retaliation to countries worldwide. But what's even more impressive, or maybe laughable depending on your sense of humor, is how predictable all of this was. Experts warned this would happen. Economists brought charts, graphs, and probably even interpretive dances explaining how tariffs on raw materials would backfire. But the warnings fell on deaf ears because apparently the phrase "it'll be fine" is a suitable substitute for years of research. Trump's administration brushed off concerns faster than a dog shakes off water. The result? Well, $2 trillion wiped off the table in just a few years. That's not strategy, that's sabotage. And the cherry on top? Europe wasn't just watching in horror, they were taking note. The $2 trillion economic blow opened the door for a bold, calculated response by EU leaders. They didn't stop with tit-for-tat tariffs. Oh no, they orchestrated a strategy so clever that it might even make you admire their audacity. Economic retaliation is one thing, but Europe had plans for more than just a slap on the wrist. They were ready to pivot their entire trade relationship away from the US. While Trump was busy puffing his chest about winning, it was Europe who quietly started changing the rules of the game. What comes next is even more fascinating. From whiskey to Levi's jeans, European retaliation wasn't just punishment. It was petty, symbolic, and genius all at once. Let's take a closer look at just how far Europe went to prove that Trump's trade policies weren't just failing. They were rewriting the global playbook. What do whiskey, Levi's jeans, and a $43 billion plane order have in common? They all became targets in one of Europe's most ingenious revenge stories ever told. When Trump launched his steel and aluminum tariffs, the EU wasn't interested in playing the victim. Instead, they clapped back with a retaliation strategy so precise it felt personal. And honestly, it kinda was. The European Union didn't just toss any random tariffs back at the US, they went after America's cultural icons. The stuff that screams "Made in America" louder than a 4th of July parade. Harley-Davidson motorcycles, tariff. Levi's jeans, slapped with tariffs too. And American whiskey, oh, Europe really came for the bourbon industry, hitting it with such high tariffs that exports dropped by over 30% in just months. That's right, 30%. Imagine the shock in Kentucky's bourbon distilleries when one of their biggest customers, Europe, essentially said, "We'll take your whiskey, but not without making it so expensive your sales plummet." It was petty, calculated, and brilliant all at the same time. But it wasn't just about numbers here. Europe's targets weren't accidental. They were intentional PR moves. Levi's and Harley-Davidson are Americana bottled up. Slapping tariffs on those brands wasn't just an economic move, it was a symbol. It sent a message both to the US government and the American public. These trade games you're playing, they come at a cost, and we know exactly where to hit you, so it stings the most. And while the whiskey industry poured out losses, the symbolism was just one part of the EU's broader retaliation. Let's talk planes. You might think airplanes are neutral territory, but when it comes to international trade, they're a battleground. Boeing, one of the most powerful symbols of American industrial strength, found itself in Europe's crosshairs. The EU didn't just consider slapping tariffs on planes, they went further. They threatened to outright cancel a massive $43 billion order for Boeing aircraft, which would have been catastrophic for an industry employing tens of thousands of American workers. A move like that wouldn't just hurt Boeing, it'd send shockwaves throughout the entire US economy. And this wasn't an empty threat either. It showed just how serious Europe was about fighting back. Here's where the drama gets even better. At every step, Europe played it cool. They framed their retaliation as purely defensive, just a necessary response to America's aggression. If Trump painted his tariffs as a show of strength, the EU painted theirs as an exercise of teamwork and justice. On the surface, their move was about telling the US to back off off with its tariffs. But underneath, Europe was playing a longer game. They were tired of being so tied to the US economy, and this trade war gave them the perfect excuse to start looking elsewhere. And by elsewhere, we mean Canada. But we'll get there soon. Let's stick with Europe's chessboard strategy for a second, because it's worth appreciating. Their goal wasn't just an eye for an eye response. They wanted to send a bigger message. America's economic dominance isn't untouchable anymore. By targeting industries and products that were as much about American identity as they were profits, Europe made it clear that anything could be up for grabs in this fight, and the timing couldn't have been worse for the US. Trump's tariffs were already making American companies bleed money thanks to higher material costs. Add in lost whiskey and jeans sales, plus the looming Boeing threat, and you had a trade war that started feeling less like a fight and more like a self-inflicted collapse. The EU's strategic retaliation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. They made it clear that America couldn't throw its weight around unchallenged anymore. And as America scrambled to contain its growing losses, Europe quietly started laying the groundwork for its next move, one that would make their position even stronger. You see, this wasn't just about tariffs and counter-tariffs. This was about rethinking the trade system entirely. What if Europe didn't have to rely so much on the US market in the first place? What if they could sidestep these problems altogether by looking for new partners? Enter Canada. The EU wasn't just fighting a reactive battle. They were also plotting how to reduce their exposure to America's unpredictable economic policies long-term. Trump's tariffs might have sparked this conflict, but Europe was thinking far beyond just whiskey and jeans. They saw the chance to pivot away from a trade relationship increasingly dominated by tariffs, threats, and unpredictability. And as the EU looked ahead, their bold moves set the stage for something bigger, an entirely new trade order. One where the US wasn't the only force calling the shots. One where a trade dispute like this wouldn't send shockwaves through their economies. Europe's revenge wasn't just about getting back at the US. It was about starting to write a new set of rules. But their next move? It would show just how clever that strategy was. Because Europe didn't just retaliate, they found a way to thrive without America altogether. And this next twist? It would take the trade war to a whole new level. What happens when the EU finds a best friend who's happy to give them what they need while the US is busy raising prices? Well, it's time to meet Canada. When your longtime ally starts acting up, you don't keep taking punches. You go find yourself a new best friend. That's exactly what the European Union did when Trump unleashed his tariff chaos. But this time, they didn't just patch the problem. They upgraded. Enter Canada, America's friendly northern neighbor, who suddenly became the EU's VIP part. Their key to success? CETA, or the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. This agreement wasn't just a casual handshake over maple syrup and croissants. It was a bold move to sidestep US tariffs entirely while giving Europe a fresh alternative. Here's how it works. CETA, which had been provisionally in place since 2017, knocked out almost all tariffs between the EU and Canada. So, when Trump came along with his steel and aluminum tax, Europe barely flinched. Instead of buying these essential materials from the US and paying extra, they looked to Canada. Problem solved. Thanks to CETA, European companies could import Canadian goods without dealing with those devastating tariffs. It wasn't a loophole, it was a whole new door, and Europe walked right through it while Trump was still out there tweeting about winning. But this wasn't just about raw materials. It was about rethinking relationships altogether. CETA didn't just help Europe dodge a steel tariff headache, it opened up billions in trade opportunities across industries. Think energy, clean technologies, and even digital infrastructure. With the EU's ambitions soaring in renewable energy and projects like smart cities, Canada wasn't just a convenient ally, they were a critical partner. Partnerships sprouted up around things like hydrogen energy, wind farms, and solar power, aligning perfectly with Europe's Repower EU plan. By 2030, the EU hopes to pump out 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen, and they're leaning on Canada to hit that number. Trump wanted global trade to revolve around America, but this shift proved the world was more than ready to pivot without. And let's not ignore the irony here. While Trump busied himself bragging about tariffs supposedly making America great again, his antics actually pushed Europe and Canada closer together. Instead of retreating into his trade bubble, the EU was out there building high-tech partnerships and securing energy deals. Meanwhile, Trump seemed more concerned about his Twitter likes than the growing trade opportunities he was missing out on. Canada quietly stepped into a role the US would have once dominated, and honestly, they did pretty well, like the friend who gets asked to fill in at a party and ends up being way cooler than the host. Take digital infrastructure as another example. Under CETA, Europe and Canada collaborated on big projects in tech, focusing on eco-friendly solutions and cutting-edge technologies for smart cities. While Trump was focused on old-school industries like coal and steel, the EU EU and Canada were basically designing the blueprint for the future. This wasn't just a trade agreement anymore, it was a statement. The world wasn't going to wait for America to catch up. Now for some numbers, because they really drive home how much ground the US lost here. Not only did CETA cut tariffs almost entirely, but trade between Europe and Canada soared. Billions worth of goods flowed in both directions, from clean energy to digital goods, reducing Europe's dependence on the unpredictable US market. Trump was busy putting up economic roadblocks, and Canada came in with smooth highways instead. But this isn't just about money, it's about global power dynamics. America loves being the dominant player, the one calling the shots. Except now, countries are starting to realize they don't need the US as much as they used to. Certainly not when leaders like Trump are at the wheel. Europe's growing bond with Canada was bigger than just avoiding tariffs. It was the beginning of a shift. It was about saying, we can build something stronger and more stable without the drama. And honestly, for Canada, it was a win-win. They got to step into the spotlight while also helping Europe sideline the US. Here's where it gets even more interesting. This wasn't just about slapping a band-aid on the tariff issues. It was about building an entirely new order, a global trade dynamic where the US wasn't the alpha. Trump's tariffs didn't just backfire because they hurt American industries. They backfired because they forced Europe to get creative, to rethink who they wanted to trade with long term. And Canada proved it could handle the job.